docudrama called Cathy Come Home, which for those of us working in housing has sort of become cult viewing. And if you haven't seen it, I do recommend it. I'm sure it's on Amazon or Netflix or something else, even iPlayer, because it was on the BBC a year or so ago. And Cathy Come Home was a docudrama, only an hour, just over an hour and a quarter long, which told the story of this woman called Cathy, how she had started with all great prospects in life and how things had just gone wrong for her and how she ended up homeless and having her children taken away from her. And it was really shocking at the time, and it really spoke in some way to everybody that watched it and actually the nation, and it inspired an awful lot of action on homelessness in the 1960s. Both crisis and shelter, coincidentally actually, were set up within 3 or 4 months of Cathy Come Home, but a lot of housing associations also came into existence at that point. And I'm going to come back to Cathy Come Home a little bit later in this presentation, because we want to talk about a group now called Homes for Cathy. But what is homelessness? And I think sometimes we think homelessness is just people who are rough sleeping. You know, we see people on the street in Norwich. We hear that Norwich City Council, YMCA, St Martin's, others, Salvation Army are doing the Pathways project, and Daryl might be able to give us some insight into that a bit later on if you've got time. And actually the sort of core figure for that is only 20 to 30 people probably in the city centre who are rough sleeping. But that is only a small percentage of homelessness. And all these other, and I will read them just in case you can't read them. The reality is people are sleeping in tents, people are sleeping in cars and on public transport, particularly in London. People spend their nights on night buses. Even people in employment spend their nights on night buses and then use gyms or whatever for a shower in the morning before going to work. Squatters, a problem particularly again in Greater London, but actually all big cities, beds and sheds. People living in hostels, sleeping in night shelters. DV, if you're not aware of that initial, it's people escaping domestic violence and living in refuges, but also people living in B&B. And actually there's a statistic which shows that a family that goes into bed and breakfast, for every 6 or 7 weeks that a young child is in bed and breakfast, they lose at least half a year's academic achievement at school. So there's a really negative, nasty element to the impact because they carry that through for the rest of their life. And of course, sofa surfing. And I remember when I was involved with the RICS, for example, 5 or 6 years ago, talking to a member of staff and discovering that he had spent the first 9 months working in London, moving from sofa to sofa, and finally got himself a place to live. And I said, well, how does that feel? He said, it's absolutely fantastic. I finally got somewhere to put my PlayStation. And for him, home was about that sort of comfort, that ability to actually have his own belongings somewhere. And we forget about that negative impact as well. And he was earning probably 20, 25,000 a year as a starter job at the RICS. But it's also people who are staying with friends and relatives because they've actually got no other option. People who are renting, who are under notice to quit, and actually they can't find the money to find a deposit for their next home. Sadly, young people who are asked to leave by parents for whatever reason. People living in a supported accommodation where there isn't any move-on accommodation for them to go to, which is actually independent. And discharged from prison. And it's quite shocking the numbers who are people who are discharged from Norwich prison each year who actually have no housing options, nowhere to go that's a permanent house. And I remember when I was out with the Pathways team in Norwich City Centre about 2 years ago, meeting a young man, and when he left prison, he was given a tent and asked to make contact each day with the probation service. And that was totally inappropriate for him. He was suffering from PTSD, he was on antidepressants, and he was just moping around the city centre, fearful for his own safety. And within 3 days, he had lost his tent anyway. In terms of how many people, and I'm sorry that these numbers are only up to date to 2016, and you don't need to look at them in great detail, but it's just sort of shocking, I think, that in 2016, almost 160,000 people were homeless in Great Britain. In England, 142,000 of that was in England, and that was up by almost 40,000 in the previous 5 years. If we look at future projections, we're heading, if we don't find some massive solutions, which is not just bricks and mortar solutions, we are heading for a real nightmare of, in 20 years' time, having almost over 300,000, 314, 315,000 people. And if you look at that graph, the sort of pale, I don't know what color that is actually, apricot, is sofa surfing. So this sort of reliance, particularly for young people, where the housing market has become so unaffordable that actually they don't find any options. By the housing market, I don't just mean home ownership, I mean rent as well. And there's another way of looking at those projections, which will look a little bit like that. So you can just see how that circle is getting bigger and bigger. So that was a little bit of context on homelessness and the fact it's not going away. It's not just visible homeless. There's an awful lot of people who are experiencing homelessness who you might see in the community, in the street, and not realize that they're in that situation. Now, a couple of years ago, The Guardian ran an article, which actually I think was a real wake-up call to the sector. And they'd done some research and showed that a lot of housing associations were actually turning down prospective tenants on the basis they were risky. And I think there was that moment for the sector of saying, if we are not the landlords who can provide the homeless with accommodation, where are they supposed to go? On the basis, especially if we're looking about social rents, our rents are significantly cheaper than the open market. And I'll just sort of give a tiny insight into what I think has driven some of that crisis of thought really in the association movement. If you can see that graph, the red line on the right-hand graph is the growth of housing association accommodation, and the blue is local authorities and how local authority housing, due to stock transfer and also, of course, due to right to buy, there's now fewer council homes than there are housing association homes in England. Now, there's an interesting debate here, and I was debating earlier with colleagues to whether to share the full story, and I probably will on a completely Chatham House unrepeatable basis. And that would come post-2000. So prior to 1979, local authorities provided council housing, and housing associations were primarily completely independent charities with core social purpose. They come out often from the local community thinking they had to do something about housing need, do something about homelessness. And whilst they got money from the government, from the Department of the Environment, and after 1974, the Housing Corporation, they weren't in any way subservient to, they were independent. Post 1988, local authorities did not get any new funding in effect for building new social housing. All the funding went to housing associations. So we started crossing that line of being quasi an extension of government. And then post 2000, increasingly, housing associations were expected to be a vehicle for government agendas. And this private story, which you can't share anywhere else, just happened about, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, where I'm going to be very tactful in my language here. I ended up sitting opposite a cabinet minister at the time, probably 4 years ago, who at a wedding. And he wanted to know who I worked for and what I did. And I explained, and he said, so are you doing X because the government have instructed you to? And I said, well, not exactly. He said, no, I've asked you whether you're doing X. I said, no, because we're doing this, that, and the other. He said, well, why aren't you doing what the Prime Minister's told you to do? And I explained that we were independent charities and we had a board of trustees that decided where we were going, what we were doing. And we spent the next 3 hours not talking to each other. It wasn't very successful, but it was that sort of feeling from government that actually housing associations have ceased to be independent charities and were there to do whatever government decided. And actually that's not what we were set up to do, and that's not what our purpose is. And I think there's an interesting debate here about what the enduring purpose of housing associations is. And I had an interesting debate last year with one of our local politicians. And we were talking about the different heritages of housing associations. And this is no judgment call at all on any of the associations that work in Norfolk. But they were saying that to their mind, it was easier for traditional housing associations like Broadland, that was established in 1963, to know what its clear, enduring purpose was, because it was set up to meet housing need. It was set up to provide housing to people who couldn't afford housing in the local market. Whereas a lot of stock transfer housing associations, and I worked for a number before I came to Broadland, were actually set up primarily because the local authority was unable to invest sufficient funding in maintenance, and they weren't able to borrow money either to maintain the property in planned maintenance terms, but also to provide new properties. And therefore a way through was to undertake a transfer to a brand new housing association. But that housing association, this politician was saying, I can see why she said it, was it was to deliver a set of promises made at transfer when they went out to a ballot of their tenants. And once they delivered those promises, it was sort of a question mark, what is our ongoing purpose? And her view was that it was clearly that the originally local authority had in mind housing need and homelessness, and it should be in our DNA. But she questioned whether some of the housing associations in the sector had actually lost some of that social purpose. And I hope not. And I hope that those that might have done will re-find it. So I mentioned at the beginning, Cathy Come Home in 1966. And for those of us with very long memories, I was only 3 years old. Apparently we won the World Cup that year, the last time and only time we won the World Cup. Unfortunately, my parents didn't have a television and they weren't interested in football, so there was no chance I was going to be watching it at all. But in 2016, a group of housing associations got together, 20 of us initially, all established in the 1960s or the very early 1970s, and said, really, we should be marking this 50th anniversary. As November comes up, people seem to, there was when Crisis and Shelter were established in 66 and early in 67, they never envisaged that there was still going to be a need for either charity 50 years later. So we need to mark it in some way, but we need to make sure that marking isn't a celebration of Cathy Come Home, but it's a reminder to everybody that actually we've got to do something about it. So we came up with this group. In the end, there were about 25 housing associations, and we did local events in Norwich. We did an event at the Theatre Royal, chaired by the Bishop of Norwich, the then Bishop of Norwich. We screened Cathy Come Home, and we did a big event in the House of Lords, where we got Cardboard Citizens, the homeless drama company, to perform their version of Cathy within the context of 2016. And then we had done all that, and 2017 came around, and we sat down and said, so was that it? Have we done what we were supposed to do? And we did a bit of a reality check and sort of recognized as associations that actually homelessness was almost a bigger problem today than it was 50 years ago. And actually, we should carry on. We should carry on making a difference, and we should stop being snobby. We were very snobby in 2016. We would only allow housing associations to join if they were formed in the 60s or very early 70s. And actually we said, no, what we need to do is we need to get everyone together that's willing to work on homelessness within the sector. And so we'll open the doors, we'll open the membership, but we'll also establish a partnership at that time with Crisis. And Crisis have worked very effectively with us, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But it was working with them to identify what we should be doing as housing associations to make sure that people realise that actually we were homelessness organisations as well, and that homelessness and housing weren't two separate subjects, but they were two sides of the same coin. Now, I'm going to try to share a video at this point. The sound test at lunchtime did work in the end. If it doesn't, I'm sure Paula will tell me. But this is a short video, it's about 3 or 4 minutes long. Whoops.
In 1966, the groundbreaking drama Cathy Come Home shone a light on one family's journey into poverty and homelessness. Over 50 years on, this story, sadly, is still relevant. Broadland Housing is one of a group of housing associations to help establish the initiative Homes for Cathy, whose aim is to help to end homelessness for the most vulnerable. Nick Wallace went to find out more.
Housing difficulty started when I was 16, really, and I sort of split up. My parents split apart. I was left to my own devices when I moved in with Dad, and then, I moved out from being with him, and then I ended up in hostels and stuff, YMCAs, the whole year on the streets. That's where all the drug addiction started. That's where it all properly started, you know, the begging and things like that for the drugs and stuff like that. I mean, it isn't nice, don't get me wrong, but you know, it's the way life took me for a little while.
Joe Newton has been homeless for 11 years, but now he's got somewhere to stay. This hostel in Norwich was built by Broadland Housing Association and is run by St Martin's Housing Trust.
Hello.
You all right?
All right, yeah, not too bad.
How are you getting on?
They come to pick me off the streets, and then that didn't work for 3 times until the 3rd time, and then it did work, you know, engaged with services and stuff like that, got on a methadone script, and then come away from all the drug use as well. So, yeah, step by step, I did get there, and I feel myself in a good position where I am today, like, very good position at the minute. Just, yeah, leaving drugs alone, and it's getting better, yeah.
There you go. Go treat yourself to a donut or something.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Not everyone's circumstances are as difficult as Joe's. Homelessness is not always visible and can be a complex problem. It's something Broadland have been dealing with for decades. Broadland Housing built their first scheme here in Norwich back in 1967, and they now have more than 5,000 quality homes across Norfolk and North Suffolk. And for everyone who works at Broadland, helping homeless people is a key part of their purpose.
Rather than just having a blanket idea of what homelessness is and you come up with one solution, it's about investing time and energy, both ourselves and with partners, whether it's local authority or other organisations like St Martin's, in understanding where that person's coming from, what their needs are, what was the cause of them becoming homeless in the first place, and addressing the whole of the person, as opposed to just thinking of it as an answer of bricks and mortar.
This way of thinking is especially important when it comes to working with homeless families and their children.
Being homeless as a child can have a massive impact on your life. So we need to make sure that that time in a homelessness hostel or temporary accommodation is as settled as possible and isn't frightening or worrying time for that child. So we make sure that we provide specific activities and we engage with those families to make sure that they're doing everything they can to move on from temporary accommodation as quickly as possible.
Josh is a care leaver who's experienced periods of homelessness, joblessness and mental health issues. He now works for Broadland Housing Group, cleaning the communal areas of their properties.
I can't thank Broadland enough, really. Without sounding too corny, it's nearly a life sort of thing. Like, I've never experienced, like, I know everything, unfortunately, everything seems to roll around money sort of thing. The life I've learned, like, that sort of thing. It's just like, I've never had a company where they've actually said, you're safe here. Literally, you're treated as a person.
The 50th anniversary of Ken Loach's powerful film about homelessness, Cathy Come Home, was marked in 2016 by the launch of the Homes for Cathy initiative. Michael told me how Homes for Cathy has developed since then, in collaboration with the homeless charity Crisis.
We opened up Homes for Cathy to any social landlord that wanted to be a member, and we then worked with Crisis. Crisis published in June last year their plan to end homelessness, and we worked with them in the run-up to that on the basis we thought very clearly that housing associations were part of the solution. It should be in our DNA.
Broadland Housing Group exists to help people, sometimes at a very difficult period in their lives. This needs resources, expertise and empathy. When it comes together, the results can really make a difference.
So that video was launched last June, a year ago June. So when he was referring to Crisis's plan for homelessness, solving homelessness, that was 2018. So where we are now, that's the Google map showing where housing associations have joined up. So you can see that we're a bit thin on the grounds in Lincolnshire for some reason. But interestingly, we've got a board meeting in a few weeks' time, and we've now got applications from housing associations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland also wanting to join with us, which is fantastic. We've gone from those 25 members to currently just over 110, 111 members. So in 2018-19, we had the Crisis, I'm going to say their plan to end homelessness. You can get this on the internet. There's various different versions. You want to read the full version, it's about 600 pages long, but they have got some executive summaries which are much more succinct. And they sort of were very much demonstrating that if with enough political will, there is a way for us to actually make homelessness something in history as opposed to the future. Part of that document is an appendix which we as Homes for Cathy developed with Crisis, which is 9 commitments that we're asking our members to sign up to. I'm going to show you a very quick video in a moment that lists them in an easier way to read than reading that list on the screen. I think it's fair to say not one of our 110, 111 members can deliver all 9 commitments perfectly today, and actually we acknowledge that. It's very much at this point about an intention and ambition that these are all things that we should be working on. So this is a quick video which hopefully lists with some pleasant music, which is sort of lift music vaguely, as a background, and goes through the 9, and hopefully you can pick them up, but then I will pick out a few to talk about specifically. You might have picked some of those up if you were reading really quickly. I think there's some important words that I'm not going to focus on later, but I think partnership is a massively important word there, and actually particularly the very first one about working with our local authority partners. The reality is no one can solve these problems locally or nationally on their own. And one of the good things, this isn't in my presentation, but one of the good things that's come out, I think, of the pandemic, one of the few good things, is actually much more joined up working by housing associations and local authorities across Norfolk to find solutions to homelessness. So anyway, that was published in June 2018, and we took a paper to our board in that September, where we were absolutely determined that we would do something on each of the 9 commitments. And we're quite happy to share, if anybody wants a copy of that board paper. It was aspirational. There's bits that we've not been as good at doing as we hoped 2 years ago we would have been. But if they let Paula know, we can send out a copy of that. But what was really good, and it was a very grown up and sensible discussion at the board, was that we signed up to doing something on each of the 9 commitments. And we recognized it was going to cost us some money. You can't do this on the cheap. And we recognized that there would be a cost, but it was actually so in line with our enduring purpose, our social purpose, the reason we were set up 57 years ago, that we had to do it. And I think the reason it made perfect sense to probably 3 core groups. The first one to our board members is actually it's what we were set up to do back in 1963. And we shouldn't lose focus on that just because we now own over 5,000 properties. To the director team, it's the purpose that we're working towards. And actually to our staff, and I think that September, so we had a staff conference shortly after the board adopted this, and actually you had this real sense across the staff, the 200 odd people that work for Broadland, that actually it's the reason that many of them had come to work in housing in the first place, to make an active contribution. So I was going to share some of our responses to just 4 of those commitments. You don't need to read them on the slides, because I'm going to unpack them a little bit. But randomly 2, 4, 7, and 8. It could have been any other set of numbers. The commitment number 2, I think, is a really important one. To operate flexible allocations and eligibility policies which allow individual applicants' unique set of circumstances and housing history to be considered. And I think this is where a lot of, if you go back to that article in The Guardian last year, where it was saying a lot of housing associations are turning down people for social housing, as were local authorities, to be fair. it comes down to not having a flexible approach to life. What you saw was some blanket exclusion policies. We don't have any blanket exclusion policies. There are certain landlords around the country that if you were a tenant of theirs even 10 or 15 years ago and you left with arrears, that you wouldn't be housed now, even though your circumstances might have moved on vastly. You know, you might have left them when you were 17 or 18 when you failed your first tenancy, and now you're 28, 29 and you've got a baby and a partner, and actually your whole outlook has changed. And there's that importance of focusing on the person rather than just a policy statement. A computer says no. What we do is actually in the last, I think it's fair to say, in the past 2 years, we haven't refused any nomination for a home. I don't think we've refused any nomination. We certainly haven't refused any nomination for a home on affordability grounds. What we do instead is understand the tenant's situation, and we sit down and work out what support they need. It is a huge failure for us, not just the tenant, if somebody moves into one of our properties and then ends up failing their tenancy. So let's know at day one that they've struggled in the past on A, B, or C. Let's work out how we support them so that it doesn't become a problem in the future. And I think it's really positive that we haven't turned down anybody on the grounds that they might not be able to afford the rent if a local authority has nominated them to us. This was perhaps the interestingly controversial one back in 2018 when we adopted, to not make any tenant seeking to prevent their homelessness homeless. And there's something about the tenant's responsibility as well as our responsibility there. It required a culture change for us. So if somebody runs up arrears in the past, we probably would have evicted them for their arrears. What we now say is, actually, if you're willing to work with us, we won't evict you. We will freeze your arrears before eviction. Doesn't mean the debt goes away. It means that we'll freeze them for a year initially, and then we'll review it on a regular basis after that, so that when you can start, as long as you pay your current rent, it's not that you can increase your arrears, but as long as you're committed to paying your current rent, we will freeze those arrears. Now, actually, in the financial costs, it's quite interesting. So we were evicting normally when, by the time we actually got an eviction, the tenant leaving us normally owed us about £3,600, sometimes a bit more than that. It would have cost us £800 in legal costs to secure the eviction. And normally, and there is actually an element here that if you're evicting somebody, perhaps they don't treat the property as well as they might do. They don't leave it in perfect condition. So we were looking at the average cost of works to a property where we'd undertaken an eviction, and actually 1,800 is probably a low estimate of what it would have cost us. We would have had a minimum of 2 weeks void, probably actually longer if there was a lot of works, and actually there's cost of staff time. So actually very easily, the cost of an eviction was £6,000, £7,000 or even £8,000. Our freezing, as I said a moment ago, is conditional on tenants working with us. We have had some evictions. In 2019, 22 evictions, where the tenants refused to engage with us. Actually, at the eviction hearing on one of those, made, as the judge pointed out, some inappropriate remarks about what they were going to do to our staff, which didn't encourage the situation. So we're still quite firm there. But actually, what's really interesting about this table, so in 2017-18, we evicted 18 families or individuals for arrears, and the gross arrears in that year was 3.82%. In 2018-19, we were down to 11, and actually in 2019-20 to lockdown, so a week before the end of the financial year, we'd only evicted 2. But the gross current tenant arrears have gone from 3.82% to actually 3.49%, which is really interesting. And actually, I asked Steph, who's on the call, why that was, and we both scratched our heads and said we couldn't quite work it all out. But it's really interesting that the expectation was our arrears would have gone up by freezing arrears. And actually, it hasn't happened. There is a cost, but it's not a write-off cost. We're not writing off that 3,600 or whatever it is the tenant owes us, so it's also not hitting the bottom line. The commitment 7 is to ensure that properties offered to homeless people should be ready to move into. And that makes such complete sense. I don't know why we didn't think about it more. If you've been living on the street or you've been living in a hostel, you may not have any furniture. You may not have a fridge, a cooker, and all that sort of stuff that we sort of take for granted if we're in our homes. So what we've done is thought carefully about what can we do that makes a property that somebody moves into possible to be a home, as opposed to a box that we're sort of parking them in. And actually it is about what makes a property a home. So we were doing silly things, if I'm honest. So we might have gone into a property which is void, and we might have taken out the floor coverings because it was left by the old tenant and they were a bit tatty or whatever reason. Well, the question, can we keep the carpet? Let's ask the family coming in, do they need it? Would that be better than actually bare floorboards? But we're also working with local charities such as Emmaus to ensure that homeless families actually have basic furniture and white goods when they move into a property. It makes it much more likely that that tenancy will be a success and that they won't abandon it. So it's good for us and it's very good for them as well. The controversial one, maybe, was to contribute to ending migrant homelessness in the areas that housing associations operate. I don't know whether anybody saw, and I haven't put it into the presentation, a very, very sad story in today's papers about the woman who died, whose body was found on Saturday, who was an asylum seeker who lost her income, and she died with her baby survived, but it turned out that she basically died of starvation. And actually, our view is actually no one deserves to be on the street. So in that instance, we've been working with the People from Abroad team at Norfolk County Council. It's a snappy title for a team, the People from Abroad team at Norfolk County Council. And we've initially, we've leased 4 homes to them at a peppercorn. So we're foregoing the rent so that they can put in people who've got no recourse to public funds, who have lost their jobs, who are processing an asylum claim or whatever it might be, and give themselves a chance to sort themselves out before they either go back to where they came from or they find a job or whatever else it might be. And that seems to be working really well. And it hasn't cost us a huge amount. It's cost us lost rent as opposed to a huge cost, but it's making a real impact. So those are just some examples of what we've been doing on some of the commitments. I'm going to talk lastly about Broadland's sort of wider role. And we've got sort of 2 wider roles. One is, it's not boring, I promise you it's not really boring, but we're sort of responsible for the organisational governance of Homes for Cathy. Bizarrely, we set up Homes for Cathy in 2016 and we thought it was quite a nice name and it would really work for us. And then we were approached by lawyers last year who do an awful lot of work for the sector and said, you know, you've actually created something quite valuable there. And what you ought to do is protect the title to prevent somebody else going off and using Homes for Cathy in some way. And we, after oohing and ahhing, we went round in circles and worked out that the easiest way to protect the name was actually to form a company. So Homes for Cathy is now a company which is registered at Broadland's offices. And we have one of the director seats around the table with Wandle Housing Association, which is a London housing association based just near London Bridge, SYHA, South Yorkshire Housing Association, BCHA, which is Bournemouth Churches Housing Association, and Hightown, which is a housing association operating just north of London. And actually David Bogle, who's the chief exec of Hightown, was the person that contacted everybody back. We've got Chris Hancock from Crisis, not the Chris Hancock that works for the Norwich City Council. There's 2, which is very confusing, both working on homelessness, who is a director as well. And we've taken the responsibility for the East of England to do our regional facilitation, to bring together land, how we can do things. And you'll be glad to know my last video is something about that regional facilitation and a workshop that we undertook last year. Fundamentally, we believe that housing associations have a key role to play in sorting out the problem of homelessness. If we can get people in the room from a lot of different landlords and local authorities and other charities to talk about the issues, to talk about the commitments that Homes for Cathy developed with Crisis, we're more likely to find ideas that will work in our own local circumstances.
I think what Homes for Cathy has done is to elevate the status of the task of eradicating homelessness, to make sure that it's a strategic priority for boards for housing associations and for local authorities, and particularly for working together. If we can all work together, then we can do so much more. That might sound like it's late to do that kind of thing, but the reality is that for a lot of organisations out there, the other pressures of financial pressures, the pressures of dealing with antisocial behaviour, all kinds of other issues are the ones that have pushed out tackling homelessness. So it's a real back to basics message.
The programme today is split into two parts. This morning it's a workshop where we got colleagues from across different landlords and different local authorities and other charities pooling ideas about how we can respond to some of the commitments. And this afternoon we've brought some external speakers to come and talk to us. We've got Tony Stacey, who's Chief Executive of South Yorkshire Housing Association, talking about what goes on in Sheffield, what solutions they found there. We've got Martin Hilditch, the Inside Housing Editor, talking about how do we change the narrative. We know that a lot of homelessness is stigmatised, that the stereotype is very negative. So how do we change the narrative in our local communities? And we've got Leslie from Shelter talking about actually our housing associations a problem.
I think it's really shown just how much commitment there is in the county to work together to end homelessness. I think so many good ideas have come out today.
Back in 2016, it was about housing associations formed in the 60s and early 70s, marking the 50th anniversary of Cathy Come Home, and saying, isn't it really sad that we've still got a homelessness problem in this country? We've moved on from there. We now have 80 housing associations who have joined hands with Cathy, who are committed to trying to work out their own answers to the 9 commitments that will make a difference in their local communities. We're still having to work on what are the best ideas. We're still having to find initiatives that will work. And we're not there yet. But the really good thing, and this workshop is a really good example about it, is that we're all willing to come together and share our ideas, share our experiences, share our successes, but more importantly, share our failures. So actually, between us, we can come up with ideas that will work here in Norfolk, but equally work in Essex or Cornwall or Cumbria or wherever else it might be. So this is my last slide, which is a summary, and then I'll hand back to Paula and she can unmute us all and we can discuss what we want to discuss. So in conclusion, I think housing associations were part, we were set up as a response to the housing need in our communities. We're not for profit, we're charitable, we're independent of government, and it's actually quite important that we hold true to what we were actually originally established for. We are there for those who are excluded from the market. Through cost and their personal needs. And as I said earlier, it's not just about those who can't afford to buy, it's about those who can't afford to pay rent. And I just have to look at how much rent my daughter is paying in London to realise how unaffordable rents have now become. I think housing associations sometimes need reminding why we're here, and hopefully Homes for Cathy is doing a bit of that. And I think it's important that we recognise that we're not just a development arm, a development tool for government. And I think the most positive thing that's come out of our 2 years of working on the commitments is finding that's actually also a clear financial business case for most of the commitments. We've got Ian, our finance director, on the line, so he's nodding, which is always a relief when you come up with a statement like that. So that's all I was going to say. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand back to Paula.
Thank you. James has actually just let everybody know that Ken Loach's film is actually available, Cathy Come Home, on YouTube, which is quite useful. So if anybody wants to go, you can probably check it out there. He's also shared a couple of facts with us, is that in October 2019, NCC found 18 rough sleepers, and Norwich invisible homeless is actually at 200 plus. So just a couple of facts and figures he's found for us there. I'm going to unmute everybody now. Hopefully that works in the next few seconds. And I was just wondering, does anybody have any questions for Michael or any member of our...
I'm going to be really cheeky and ask Daryl from the YMCA. I wonder whether you're willing, I'd forgotten that you're going to be on the call tonight, to say a little bit about pathways in Norwich.
Okay. So hi everybody. So I'm the operations director at the YMCA, and just before we talk about pathways, we provide 228 bed spaces every night across the county for under 25s that are homeless. And we've been operating in Norwich now since 1856. And yes, the operations have changed over that time, but it has always been linked to the provision of housing for single people. And, you know, it's great that we've been around a long time, as has the Homes for Cathy. But we also took on a charity called Umbrella, which was formed as a result of Cathy Come Home. And that now sits under our arm and provides 26 units of accommodation for young parents who are homeless, and they stay with us for 2 to 3 years. They're usually parents where children are either at risk of being taken into care or have just had them back, so we're able to provide that supportive environment. Because of the work we do across the city in homelessness, we are part of the Partnership for Pathways. There are 6 partners: St Martin's Housing Association, ourselves, the Feed, Salvation Army, Future Projects, and at the time it was City Reach, but City Reach no longer exists, but we have got the staff within the partnership. We were set up as a result of funding from the City Council for a 3-year project to tackle rough sleeping across the city. And it's the recognition that, as Michael's already put in the presentation, rough sleeping isn't just about the man on the street. It is a number of options, and young people, particularly for us, are those sofa surfers or living in very unstable accommodation. They don't tend to be rough sleepers. And that's certainly come out in all the facts and figures. When lockdown happened in March, so March the 23rd, we were all tasked to get people off the streets. We put 50 people up in accommodation in Norwich at that first part of lockdown. And yes, numbers changed during that time, and the numbers certainly increased. Those people are now going through into more stable accommodation, be that hostels or other forms of accommodation. Some people have gone into tenancies, but there is still always someone else to replace the person that we have rehoused. And I think that's the sad bit. Lockdown brought forward a lot of people that were probably staying with friends and family, and people didn't want to share households. So suddenly the numbers were a lot higher than we probably anticipated at that stage. And homelessness hasn't gone away over all these years. The government's got an agenda to reduce homelessness. And I think working in the sector, we'd all probably agree that it won't ever be zero. It can't ever be zero. Even in those countries where they've got housing first, etc., there are still people living in unsuitable housing, and homelessness is about unsuitable housing as well. Don't know if that helps, Michael. I would have come with some facts and figures if I'd know.
No, well, I saw you looking, you were looking intense. I thought this is a brilliant opportunity. But I think the work that Pathways have been doing since they were established has been fantastic. And the fact they go out every morning, okay, it's primarily the city centre, and we've got to recognise that homelessness isn't just a city centre issue in Norfolk, but the fact they know where people will be and are able to pick up their needs, make sure that they're registered appropriately and their health needs are also met has been fantastic.
Absolutely. The other part of the project is as well, we've been funded by the Ministry of Housing, not just through this part, that we have resettlement workers and tenancy outreach workers. And the tenancy outreach workers are preventing people from becoming homeless, and they're working with rough sleepers who have got accommodation and their accommodation is at risk of failing. So they might have been homeless a year ago, 6 months ago, and that team are particularly working to prevent those people coming back on the streets. And we've had some really good outcomes there. I mean, one of the challenges, which is one of the 9 commitments, is around how we make someone's home a home. So it's fine to give someone tenancy, but one of the things we have struggled with is people gathering around the Haymarket, for instance, and it's not that they're homeless, it's because they need that social interaction, because their home is not a home. Their home is 4 walls, it hasn't maybe got furniture or a television, or they haven't integrated with their community yet. And one of the things that we're trying to tackle is how we can actually make sure that when people get a home, it becomes a home.
Yeah, that's really important. Any other comments or questions?
Do you think that homelessness is more in between like the early age, teenage years, i.e. when they leave school or get kicked out of home? Or do you think it's more people who are in the military who left the military and found it unlucky to get somewhere?
I think I'm going to again come
Can
back.
I answer?
Yeah, you have a go. I was going to say there's reasons why each age group, and every reason is actually unique to that individual. But yes, there are some strands, whether it's to do with being young or relationship breakup or being in an institutional environment like the army or the navy, etc. But Daryl, your thoughts?
I mean, if you're under 18, then you know you're the responsibility of children's services still. So anyone under 18, you need to be assessed by them. So the homelessness figures really look from 18 upwards, but that isn't to say that you don't get under 18s, because you do, and some of them might be care leavers or you know, some really sad family breakdowns. But we do get people even on the streets who have been in their 80s. So you do get a range of people from all ages, but the biggest age is probably more about that sort of 40s to 60s sort of age group. And I would have said earlier, about a year and a half ago in Pathways, we would have said our core was always males, single males, but actually we're seeing more females on the street now. And the other thing we're seeing on the street is couples, and couples are really hard to find alternative accommodation for, because most hostel accommodation is single rooms. So that means to actually put two people together is really, really difficult and challenging. And we do find that in Norwich, that we have quite a lot of couples. And then the other thing that Michael's presentation briefly touched on is those people who have no recourse to public funds. And that is really, really difficult to, might be able to get them off the street, but that ongoing cost responsibility becomes the challenge in terms of where that gets picked up. We're very fortunate that we get a lot of church groups who actually help and support the community, so that does come into effect. But going back to the question about ages, you will find that it is mostly those middle-aged group, and that can be veterans, that can just be, you know, relationship breakdowns. We have a lot of people who move into the city because of the good resources that we have, so you know that also takes up quite a lot of people as well.
Thank you. James, I think you have a question.
Please, directed at Michael. I've been through the homeless system, having spent Christmas with Crisis at Westminster Polytechnic, being classed as vulnerable to the whole system. And I moved into my Broadland apartment, and I had a sleeping bag, some cutlery, pots and pans from my van, but that was it.
Yeah.
So when did Broadland actually start offering white goods or linking?
I'm going to bring Steph in on this actually. We've tried to do it through our tenancy support for quite a long time, but it's sort of now in a more formal way. Okay. Often in the past, it was about ensuring that we understood the circumstances of the person that was becoming our tenant. And too often at that point, I think it was our tenancy support team, which is about 8 people in the organisation, who the request got directed to. Whereas I think we now have a more structured way of doing it. Steph, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, so I think that's fair. I think really since probably like 2010 with the welfare reform, we've really recognised it's really, really important. But I think what we've done is we've tried to do it in a way, mainly through tenancy support, which is quite a small team when you look at the number of allocations that we have. And we tried to do it in that way. And that's what we found in tenancy support is we rely on pots of money from elsewhere. So we apply for grants and we apply for funding from lots and lots of agencies. And what we found is that those pots are getting smaller and the applications are increasing more and more and more. So what we, at one point where we actually found we were getting quite a lot and could support a lot of tenants with the money that was there in Norfolk through all these pots, is we actually found that we were competing against more and more applications, and actually the pots were shrinking because people were having to decrease their budgets, and some of those things were seen as a luxury. So what we found was we were applying and either it was taking longer or we were getting less money, And the key thing that we found was actually is you need to start working with the individual as early as possible. So what we do now, and take your point, James, that this has come too late for some people, but what we do now is as soon as we know that someone's coming through and either they haven't held a tenancy before or they don't have the furnishings they need to make that property a home, because that's what they want, that we know that's what they want, is that we start that really early on. So what we'll do is we'll look at that as soon as interview comes, and we will work with that person so that we're not moving them in and then applying to help them get carpets 8 weeks later, because that's not going to work, and some tenancies fail in that time. So we're trying to do more up front. And we've also got some budget our own. This year we've got some budget allocated to just helping furnish people's homes, which has come through Homes for Cathy. And yeah, and that's been really, it's only been since April, but already that budget is proving to be really useful. So there just isn't the money out there. A lot of the assistance schemes people have to pay back through their own benefits. And when people are coming in and on very, very low incomes already, necessarily having to have deductions from their benefits isn't going to help them in the longer term. So then we need more. That's what we need, James. We need more pots available to us to help us. We will also take furniture from people who donate it where we can. The team will, they'll do whatever they can to get donations. But again, with that, it's very difficult because you have to have places to store it, etc. So we need to do more.
Do you guys work in partnership with other charitable institutions like the Benjamin Foundation and etc. Emails? So, okay, I'll give you an example. We've got somebody in temporary accommodation, homeless, moved into temporary accommodation by Norwich City Council. They're on the home options list and there's a tenancy available, so they apply and they're first on the list, they get it. Now they view it on Tuesday. They have to sign up on Thursday and get the keys on Friday.
Yeah.
It's maybe a question for another time, but you see where I'm going.
It's a very valid question. Yeah. I think one of our problems is we do not have a place to store furniture.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not asking.
No. I would love us to be able to do it, and it may well be that. I suppose maybe it'll be one of the outcomes of the pandemic. There may well be some warehouses which might now be empty where landlords don't actually want too much rent for a year or two. But we have to, the ideal for that scenario, that example, is actually we can say, well, that's fine. We've got this bed, we've got this fridge, etc. We've got this armchair. We can move them to the property, but because we've got nowhere to store the stuff, it's very difficult for us. So we don't get it in advance. Currently, it's about when we know the prospective tenant's got the need. That's when we have to look for it.
Okay, I would make the suggestion that in order to get people out of the temporary accommodation, which is generally not very good because people have various issues and dependencies, is it possible to offer furnished or part furnished accommodation? Would that be an option? I'm thinking of different ways that different cities have addressed homelessness. And
it's certainly something we've got to look at. I mean, one of the things we really want to make a big move on is housing first, which is housing first in a very simplistic way is where you're providing a home to somebody who's currently rough sleeping. You are putting a package of support, but you're actually prioritizing. The reason it's called housing first is you're giving them the housing first, rather than saying you've got to jump through all these loops, live in temporary accommodation, live in hostel accommodation before you get your own home. That's not, housing first isn't perfect for everybody by any means, but it's very good for many. And for those, if we are successful in going down the housing first route, it will be contingent on actually having furnished accommodation, because there is actually no point in moving somebody directly from living on the street into a box. Because as you say, moving into your home with just a sleeping bag and some cutlery, etc., that didn't make your home a home overnight at all. It just made it somewhere that you felt safer to sleep, maybe.
And yes,
that's not really good enough.
Yeah.
Andrew Savage, did you have a question? You
I did. You could see my little hand going up, didn't you? I was just going to say the point. We've just literally put in 4 bids, 2 for Kings Lynn and 2 for Norwich City Council, on new accommodation, move on type accommodation from the Next Steps Fund with MHCLG, and all those bids have got fully furnished in them. So we might not be able to go backwards, but we're certainly very quickly, but we're certainly going forwards in that manner. So we've got also another 7 properties we've just put in for planning in Kings Lynn, Reed Way, a modular scheme, but that will be fully furnished. And we've just picked up some work with Great Yarmouth to help them put in 35 one-bedroom flats into Great Yarmouth, and all that's going to be fully furnished as well. So you can see, James, going forward, it's a little bit easier because I can sort of don't tell our finance director, but I can play with the capital a little bit.
There is an interesting
helps.
challenge there, Andrew, which is, we'll build these homes. People in need will move into them, but they won't move on again.
No.
And actually, you won't resolve the homelessness situation by doing it just once.
No.
And what we actually need is a sustained programme, being able to provide generally 1-bedroom accommodation to a furnished extent. And it's finding the model that works, that we can afford, in essence. But, great that we're doing all this work right now. And we probably wouldn't have got such progress on it without the pandemic, if we're honest.
Yep.
And the government, as Dara was talking about, getting people off the street sort of overnight, but over a week, and not wanting to actually see them all go back. But actually, you then get stuck in process. But it's about a sustained programme, and recognising that it's not it's not temporary accommodation. We're not giving somebody, when we give those 1-bedroom homes, it's not saying and you can stay there for a year, because actually that's not your home if you know that you're living, knowing that you're going to have to be moving out in a year's time. So it's actually having, where are we going to get the funding? And this is where we need to actually keep the pressure on MHCLG and Treasury to ensure the funding carries on to replace those properties in the future for new people that need it.
Thank you. Ian Fox, I think you have a question. You had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. It's a more general question, actually. I may have missed it at the start in the slides, but what is the ultimate goal of the homes for Cathy? I mean, is it actually to have a surplus stock of accommodation? Because ultimately, as you say, there's always going to be somebody new arriving homelessness to find somewhere to live. I mean, so to have a bed for everybody or a home for everybody, is that possible? Or is it actually to go further than that, actually say, and is it more hostels? Michael, you just started to talk about that. You said, it's a hostel, because ultimately homelessness is, as you say, a variety of different scenarios. But all those scenarios can be, in short term, brought into hostels potentially. Well, then they're off the street, they're off the sofa, they're in a hostel, it's more accommodating, and then maybe it's moved them into a more permanent home. But is there a short-term solution followed by a more longer-term solution? And what is the ultimate goal, therefore, for you and your associated housing associations? I mean, because we've seen how the sorry, I'm going on a bit, but we've seen how the COVID pandemic has enabled the government to find money where we didn't think they could ever find it, and therefore I would say that they can find money for more houses and homes if they wanted to. And is that the ultimate goal? Therefore, is a home for everybody?
I think that's a really good question, and there's no instantaneous one sentence answer. I think the first one on Homes for Cathy and what does success look like for Homes for Cathy. I doubt we'll ever be fully successful, and that's good in a way, because it means we've always got something to push against. Success for Homes for Cathy is actually every single housing association of any size in this country taking homelessness seriously. We have seen some London housing associations that really have gone, I'm not being rude about them at all, but they have actually got linked totally to home ownership and low cost home ownership and shared ownership, and actually forgotten that their core purpose when they were set up, and many of them were set up in the 60s, was about the people who are homeless and in most need. And actually there's something about the reality that rents have got to be affordable to the people that are living in them. And if we are providing homes to those people who are least well off in our society, actually we need to be making full effort there. So, you know, whilst we've got 110, you heard in the video, at the point we recorded that video, it was 85, so we're 25 more, 30 more. But actually there's 1,300 housing associations of any size in England alone. And actually, wouldn't it be fantastic if all 1,300 took it seriously? Because actually, if all 1,300 made a little effort, it's a much bigger contribution than just 110, 115 making a big effort. Part of Homes for Cathy is about looking at what we're doing in organisations to make sure that we are maximising our effort. And part of Homes for Cathy is about lobbying. So working with MHCLG, it was really encouraging through the pandemic that one of the first people the homelessness team at MHCLG wanted a meeting with were the directors of Homes for Cathy. Say, does this make sense about what we're doing? And actually there's a sort of reality that we can only do so much. And if we're providing homes for people who can't afford them, by definition, because of land cost and build cost, we need some form of subsidy. So whatever our sense of ambition, if we can't persuade the Homes England and local authority partners and Treasury ultimately to put the money up, then we won't be successful. In terms of what accommodation, I mean, ultimately, what we want to do is see sufficient housing supply. So actually we don't have so many people on the housing waiting list, but we need appropriate accommodation for different people's needs. Housing first will be a solution for some. Hostel accommodation will be the right step. Something like you saw in the first video of Dibden Road in Norwich, or Bishopsbridge House in Norwich is another good example of the YMCA in Norwich, is the right place for some people going through whatever circumstances they've got. And it's ensuring that we don't have a situation where people have got no options at all but to actually bed down in a dangerous location or to constantly sofa surf. So you might say it's unrealistic, we'll never achieve what we want to do. In the same way that Crisis back in 1966, 67, when they were set up, actually their dream was to end homelessness in this country. And 50 years later, 52 years later, we still haven't. But I think if you don't start your journey somewhere, you'll certainly never get to a destination. And we may be passing the baton on to the next generation of people at Broadland or whoever, but I think it's really important that actually we begin with our end in mind, which is actually that we maximise the impact we can make as an individual housing association in Norfolk and a bit of Suffolk on homelessness. I don't know whether anybody else wants to contribute a thought.
Just a very quick one, Michael, is that, you know, the COVID situation got them all off the street. So with the resources there, we know we can stop rat trapping. We might not be able to stop the global element of homelessness, but certainly we were able to get people off the streets and into accommodation and support services in place as well. And I think that's a thing to remember, that with all the shove of the money behind there, it was actually making us go that step to actually achieve some of the 9 principles that are there. And that's one of the things that needs to be followed up. The resources need to be there for organisations to carry on the work that they've been doing.
Before I hand over to James, I'll just say it's got to be accommodation that's the right accommodation. So I know that there were some instances where people got off the street and they were put into inappropriate accommodation, a hotel where they were told they weren't allowed to leave their rooms, or actually a 4-bedroom house where they each put into a bedroom and told this is your slot for going to the bathroom and there's no socialisation permitted because we've got to prevent any risk. So actually you've got to be really careful we're not putting people in boxes that actually become prisons for them as opposed to a home for them. James,
yes,
you were waving.
Daryl, you said we got everybody off the streets, but that's not really true. I myself know of 2 people who were throughout from March until today are still rough sleepers, sleeping in a tent in the woods alongside the river. Yes, pathways have been to them, but they decline because they don't want to go to a hostel like Bishopsbridge House. They don't feel safe. So it goes back to what Michael was saying, appropriate accommodation is what we need, not just putting people in a hostel where we've got a variety of issues with each client, from addiction issues to criminal issues. For some, especially the older rough sleepers, they decline the offer. Sorry, I'm ranting here.
No, it's fine, because that was actually one of the problems for moving people on from the accommodation they went into, was actually getting that move on into the appropriate accommodation. Michael's mentioned housing first. We haven't really got any good housing first models in Norfolk yet, in terms of the true sense of it, giving someone a house and then unpacking the issues that they may have, so they live without any of the rules and regulations that you do when you take on a tenancy. And that's something we need to start looking at in Norfolk, and actually establishing that so that we can help people like that, so they get that roof over their head, the support, the wraparound support, and they can actually deal with all the things they need to deal with without feeling that they'll lose that house. So I'm not disagreeing with you. You can't make someone come in if they don't want to. And that is the same when we have the winter night shelters and everything. You can't make someone come in if they've chosen a particular lifestyle as well.
But there were some that went in, but then went out again.
Yeah, they did. There's also an interesting debate about the true cost. So there's a debate going on currently, which is the terminology they're using is about housing first, high fidelity or low fidelity. High fidelity is where actually you fund appropriately the support that's needed. However, politically, low fidelity is more affordable. We're getting a bit of slack as Homes for Cathy, because we're lobbying, and we supported lobbying for a high fidelity model, and then people are saying, hold on, that's unachievable. Shouldn't you have gone for low fidelity, because you're more likely to get the funding? And that's a sort of challenge that we're facing. So by pushing for what's really needed, there's a risk we won't get anything. But if we push for low fidelity, it won't actually be fit for purpose, and you'll see people failing on housing first. And this is why the politics of this is actually very significant. And what we have, we can argue over the pandemic.